Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another one of our exciting interview series. For those of you who've been following along, this will be our fourth interview in the run-up to what we expect to be a glorious, glorious first ever Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy virtual conference over 3 days, 6 panels, including a student panel. We are very excited about this. And today we are extremely lucky. It took a little bit of work because she's very shy. It took me a little bit of work, but we got the chief, the boss, the president of the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, the brains behind all of these efforts, here with us today, who is going to chat a little bit about herself and her work, which is actually even more interesting. So I am just delighted to have visiting with us today Silvia Pedraza. She's a professor of sociology and American culture at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Her research interests include the sociology of immigration, of race and ethnicity in America, as well as the sociology of Cuba's revolution and exodus. Exodus is going to be a big word in today's conversation, I hope. I'm going to press on this. Right. Her research seeks to understand the causes and consequences of immigration as a historical process that forms and transforms nations. She's the author of several books, all worth reading. She's the author of several books, including Political Disaffection in Cuba's Revolution and Exodus, which is Cambridge University Press, and has a forthcoming book on revolutions in Cuba and Venezuela, One Hope, Two Realities, together with her co-author, Carlos Romero from the Universidad Central de Venezuela. And that is going to be published by the University of Florida Press. I have heard her speak about it, and it is very exciting. So I'm going to pull a little bit of that from you too, if I can. Now, in the American Sociological Association, Professor Pedraza was chair of several sections, the Latino Sociology, Race and Ethnic Minorities section, and the International Migration sections. She's also served on their council. At the University of Michigan, she teaches courses on American immigration, historical and sociological perspectives, Latinos in the US, social problems and social issues, among others. And here we have, in the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy, a lawyer and a sociologist talking, which I think is a very good thing. It shows you how broad the association has become. And I was hoping that we'd be able to start. Sylvia, if you can tell us a little bit about yourself, where you started and how you wound up at Michigan as a sociologist and as a sociologist of Exodus. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. This is something that I have thought a lot about because I am, of course, a child of the Cuban Exodus, but so are many other people, and it did not compel them to study the Cuban Exodus and the Cuban Revolution as it has in my case. So I think as I analyze my life and how I got to focusing on the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban Exodus, I think that a very, very important part of that was the influence of my family in two different ways. Okay, one way is my family, as when I was very young as a child, would always tell me the stories of the great ancestors who had fought for the Cuban War of Independence against Spain. And they had literally fought, you know, in the fields with machetes and on horses, on horseback. They had also fought in the underground resistance in Las Villas province in Santa Clara. And they had, the women, for example, had embroidered, Victoria Pedraza embroidered the flag that Máximo Gómez, you know, used in his contienda, in his conflict with the Spanish. And so these were sources of pride in my family, that people felt that they were very patriotic, very wedded to Cuban history, much as they also, by the way, loved Spain. Every time they took a vacation, they went to Spain.
We all do that.
But they wanted
families.
independence.
Right.
But they wanted independence from La Madre Patria. And so I grew up with this, and yet at the moment in which the Cuban Revolution triumphs, 1959, 1960, my family divided completely and totally between those who rejected it and saw it as horrible, communism and we need to leave and we'll be back in a few months, but we have to go because we can't accept this. And the other half of my family, who on the contrary became wedded to the revolution, affirmed by it, rose within it. And this was on both sides of my family, both the Pedrazas and the Lubian and the Rodriguez. I have everything that you can imagine very close to me as a kin. For example, my cousin Chiqui Gomez Lubian died putting a bomb against Batista, and he became a martyr of the revolution in Santa Clara. But also in Santa Clara, another one of the family members, Augusto Vidaurreta, was a political prisoner for close to 10 years because he worked with the CIA against the communist turn of the Cuban Revolution. And so you name it, everybody, you know, my uncle in Cuba, Rafaelito, as we called him, Pedraza, was a true believer in communism as a better world to live in. And my father detested it. My father was very pro-American. He had studied at MIT in the United States. He loved the United States and its history, and he hated communism. And so, you know, these were all people who I love and who loved me. And so I think I needed to make sense of that. And I'm still working at it because it has never ceased, in effect, okay? In recent years, you know, in the last 10 years or so, I have had more cousins who left Cuba, my generation and younger, for Spain, many of them for the United States, others of them. So it's an exodus that continues to divide a family that when I was a child was very, very close emotionally and very close physically. You know, we lived very close to one another. We didn't have to go very far to see each other. We often got together as a family and enjoyed family gatherings. Everyone always knew that there were deep differences, okay? The Cuban Revolution did not create the problems in my family. The family was like a plate where you can see some cracks, you know, that are there. And then came the revolution and it went, it shattered all over the place. So, you know, it didn't create them, but it certainly did make it impossible for people to continue to love each other in the casual, warm way in which they had in the past. For many, many years, many of them did not talk to each other, did not write to each other. And I was the sole link. I was the only one that talked to everybody. And so I truly think that trying to make sense out of how different people in my family had seen a process that was, you know, a very much a part of Cuban history, and to try to understand it from the point of view of people that I loved, and that ultimately achieved small forms of reconciliation with each other. Not very large, but, and again, it was through me. It was always through me that the little bit of communication that took place actually ended up taking place. So I think that that was a major, major influence in my life. How do I make sense of this thing that shattered the family that I loved and that loved me into so many little cracks and pieces? But I think that there was also another major influence, and the other major influence is I went to, first of all, a Quaker high school in Maine, because there were two Cuban teachers there who were sisters from Santa Clara, Carmen and Margot Diaz, who had been my parents' teachers in Santa Clara when they were young. So they sent me to a Quaker school up there, and I had a very good, very broad, Quakers are very socially conscious people. You know, they were the backbone of, actually they were the backbone of the women's movement and the civil rights movement and the anti-slavery abolition movement, you know. And so they I think were also an important influence in my life. And then there was afterwards the University of Michigan. I teach at the University of Michigan now, but I was also a student at the University of Michigan, which has always been a very global university. I had friends, dear friends, who were from everywhere in the world. You know, there was a cultural, and still is there, and I hope our pandemic doesn't take it away from us. There was always a cultural richness, a globalization of, you know, courses and people and opportunities and lectures and so on. That was very appealing to me, and it still is. And then after I graduated from U of M, I went overseas and I lived in Malaysia. In Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, for almost 2 years. I came back from Malaysia to go to graduate school at the University of Chicago. And Malaysia was a deep influence in my life, also in my subject of study, because it had been a British colony. It had gained independence not too long. You know, people who were just a bit older than I had gone to school under the British school system. So it was still sort of there, you know. It was a plantation society like Cuba. The British had brought the Indians and the Chinese from South China and South India to work as indentured servants and put them in different parts of the social structure. So they created an enormous race problem. And then I saw all of this in front of my eyes, you know, this enormous diversity that didn't really belong to me. It wasn't Caribbean. It wasn't from the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't American. And it rolled out in front of my eyes for 2 years like a movie. And it wasn't my movie. But I think that afterwards I knew that what I wanted to study was immigration as a social process that forms and transforms nations. And that is what I have been doing. And that is the leitmotif of all of my work, really.
Wow, wow, wow. That is just that, and it's so interesting to hear this. Your stories about your family and its ups and downs is, I've heard this so often among especially larger Cuban families. It's the same thing, the families will split. The revolution was kind of like an accelerator of the factions and the tensions that were already inherent now with a political face, right? With a political face, people coming, people going, eventual reconciliations in part, sometimes not. So just amazing, but that is something that replicates itself throughout the community. And we're still, even though there's been quite a number of years since the revolution, it's something that still, at least for Cuban families in this country and in Spain, to my understanding, remains very, very, it's as if it was still yesterday for a lot of families. It is
yes.
very,
Absolutely.
very close.
Absolutely.
So it is just fascinating to hear this, but I want to now focus a little bit on that work, on this migration as both a normative concept, a metaphor, and a centering for understanding the way things work. Just, I love talking to sociologists. I'm sorry, it's so cool. It's so cool.
Oh, I'm glad you do. Not very many people do.
So I was wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about your work on Cuban migration.
Oh, well, I think there have now been, I just wrote an article for Foro Cubano, and I highlight this because it was Pavel Vidal, who is also a member of ASCE, who invited me to do it. And I did not know about Foro Cubano until then. They write for a very broad public. They actually don't even want you to put references in the article, which astonished me.
Oh, yay.
Yeah, it's very broad. And I wrote an article that it's called El Éxodo Cubano, the Cuban Exodus, 5 Waves in 60 years. Okay,
Whoa,
it is the case that now the Cuban Revolution, whatever it is that is called the Cuban Revolution, is 60 years old. And there have been 5 very distinct waves of exiles that have come mostly to the United States, but secondarily also to Spain, Puerto Rico, Canada, Costa Rica, and so on, you know. And each one of those waves has been very distinct. The first couple of waves were initially studied by Nelson Amaro, who also used to come to ASCE meetings. He's now living in Guatemala, and Alejandro Portes, and they characterized those waves as those who wait, the early waves, those who wait, because it was upper middle class, white Cubans who were waiting for the United States to come in and solve the problem. And of course, the way in which the United States did that was Bay of Pigs, which, as we know, was a failure strategically and militarily, and in effect then gives rise to the second wave, which is those who Amaro and Portes call those who escape. You know. And so then I took it over. You know, I was younger, but I got old enough to take it over, and I studied Los Marielitos and added them to the waves that were there. And Los Marielitos, as we know, the immigrants from the Mariel Exodus, 1980, were more working class, unskilled, semi-skilled workers, very often young men alone, large presence of Black Cubans, a lot of presence of gay Cubans, artists, intellectuals also. And all of this takes place in only 1 year, in which they come to Miami, 125,000 persons. At that time, my mother was a bilingual education teacher at Hialeah. And, you know, her classrooms filled up with all these little Cuban kids that had to be taken care of immediately. And so I call them those who hope. But then we have the Balsero exit in the mid of the 1990s, particularly in the summer of 1994, responding to the conditions of enormous deprivation that took place in Cuba when the Soviet Union collapses. And Soviet Union and Eastern European communism, and along with them collapses the generous subsidy that was keeping Cuba afloat. Also all the commercial links and economic links which was with the Soviet Eastern European societies. And then in Cuba, you have what Fidel Castro euphemistically calls the special period, el periodo especial. And that meant for most Cubans in the island, enormous want, enormous hunger. It is something that nobody in Cuba wants to live through again. And right now they're frightened by the way that the conditions are going, because they keep saying it's not going to be again el periodo especial. It won't be, but it is, of course, that they're afraid that it may become so, because they already lived through it once and they can't possibly live through it again. And so I called them those who despair, because they were so desperate that they left on rafts, on anything that floated at all. And a number of people died in the crossing. Others ended up in Guantanamo until the United States was able to process them for a couple of years. And then more recently, 2014, 2016, we had a wave of people who left Cuba to Ecuador, because Ecuador did not require visas for Cubans, worked in Ecuador for a while, and then walked. There were large caminatas of people who were mostly, of course, very young, because they walked throughout all of Central America in order to reach Mexico, in order to come to the United States. And so there's 5 very, very distinct waves over very different historical moments.
What do you call that last wave?
I think I call them, it's better in English than in Spanish, because in English it's those who walk, but those who walk is, walking is, it means, you walk the talk, you walk your beliefs.
Right.
Well, in Spanish, it's los caminantes is more straightforward, just people who are walking. It doesn't refer to their beliefs.
Right.
So it doesn't translate as well as it could, but.
Okay, wow. Okay, so
I've been keeping up with all the waves. And I hope that they will end while I'm still alive, since I have become the person that writes about the waves.
Well, that's right. And the walkers especially were particularly interesting for me for a couple of reasons. One, of course, the danger was extraordinary. Even driving, assuming you can, there are choke points in that route. Between Colombia and Panama, between Nicaragua and Guatemala, all of Honduras, all of them are just extraordinarily dangerous places, especially for people without very many means and just walking.
Right.
And the other part that was interesting to me is that all of this is occurring, of course, at the same time that there's a politics of migration coming out of Central America, with those organized masses of families who then march on like crusades, march to the border. You always heard about them, the Central American families who were marching towards the border to be let in, but you hardly ever heard about los que caminan. Los
caminantes,
that's very true. I'm wondering what the difference. The Americans were obsessed with all the Central Americans coming in, had nothing really on everyone.
Hardly. They hardly made it to our social media. Yeah, I agree. But I have, in all of this work, I have, one of the things that's happened over time is that methodologically, and sociologists care a lot about methodology. It's all they talk about most of the time, really. And that methodologically, I have come to rely more and more on in-depth interviews. While I was trained originally as a demographer, so it, over time that has served me well, because as a demographer, I can read data very well. I can read trends, very well. I know what's underneath one number, so to speak, different trends in effect. But in order to get at how people understood the decision to leave their country, which is a monumental decision,
Right.
the circumstances that drove them to do it, the family splits that were involved, which of course interested me enormously, how they saw themselves in the middle of the enormous conflict between Cuba and the United States, which took different forms at different times, but has always been there. And in order to capture all of that, I needed to do in-depth taped interviews. And so little by little, I became more of a qualitative and less of a quantitative researcher. And also more historical, because now I have the long history of all of the Cuban Revolution in front of me to study. And I've always loved history. And so, and also the fact is that Cubans came to the United States also at very different moments in American history, So history is the backdrop, but it's an important curtain, so to speak.
Okay.
So
well, I've got two questions. So in all of this conversation, you made me remember something, and then I have a more current question. Those who wait start the current system, the current sociology of migration from Cuba, but it wasn't the first. I remember as a kid going to Ybor City.
Yes, that's true.
Las olas de migración de Cuba from the Spanish colonial period, the Cuban colonies and the tobacco factories in Ybor City and the like. Is there a connection? Was there ever a strong connection one way or another between the pre-revolutionary migration waves from Cuba into the United States and those that occurred starting from those who wait?
Sometimes people have tried to maybe think about one giant, so to speak, Cuban exodus beginning in the 19th century and so on. But it's not very successful when you do it that way, because the circumstances that they're leaving are so different, And, the backdrop of communism in Cuba is so strong. Even after communism falls, it's still the consequences of the fall of communism. So it's not very successful to try to make it into one giant story. However, having said that, I think that, for example, when I read the work of Oscar Hijuelos, who's a novelist, and he's written a lot about the 1930s, the 1940s, and the 1950s. His most famous book was turned into a movie, The Mambo Kings Play Songs. Right. And right now there have been, until recently, and because of the pandemic, has of course stopped all forms of communication, practically speaking. But the fact is that there have been recently a lot of Cuban musicians coming to Miami and to the United States, absorbing a lot of cultural and artistic influences here, going back to the island. So there is actually a sense in which very recent immigrants in some ways remind one of the old immigrants, and a lot of give and take.
That's right. Desi Arnaz is, of course,
yes, the Desi Arnaz. That's right. And Lucille Ball is still there.
Which is how I learned English. Watching. It was the only show my parents
I love Lucy.
The only show my parents would put on the TV, and so the only thing I'd understand would be when Ricky Ricardo would go off on Lucy, and oh my God, he's speaking something I understand. Right. So
that's cute.
So, and then the second question on that. All right, so it's difficult to connect them, although one sees it. The second question is, we've got these 5 groups.
Right.
How well do they get along with each other? And to what extent, and in a sense, that really hides a different question, and that is, do these groups view themselves, do they constitute themselves as distinct from each other, or is this something that's imposed on them from outside?
No, I think that they legitimately see themselves as different. And I'll tell you how I've tried to capture that difference. There is a Hungarian sociologist, and it's no accident. He also knew something about Hungary, who came up many years ago in the early 70s with the concept of vintages, as in a wine, the wine of this year versus the wine of that year. And he basically said that refugee groups are like vintages of wine because they take with them as they leave very different processes of maturation. So that concept of vintages has helped me try to understand the fact that some vintages do understand each other. They're different, but they're simpatico, so to speak. And some of them are, on the contrary, hostile to one another and cannot understand each other at all. Okay. More recently, my friends in the humanities talk about the something of desire and memory, for example. And that's also been helpful to me to think about it in that way, because I think that the early groups of Cuban exiles, the first, the second wave, were leaving the old Cuba, the Cuba that was there before the communist society. La Cuba de ayer is what I usually call it, to make for short. And it was a Cuba that, of course, was unfair to many people who were poor and unequal and so on, but it had a lot of beauty to it. You know, the music and the dancing and the beaches and the palm trees, you know, and they're very nostalgic about it. You know, there's a lot of nostalgia for that beautiful past that was there. While the more recent vintages of Cuban exiles, particularly after the collapse of communism in 1989, 1990, and the periodo especial, and the suffering and the want that involved for people, people don't have those beautiful memories. Very often what they remember, a friend of mine who I interviewed, who is now a good academic, told me that he did not understand what that nostalgia was all about, that he remembered having eaten out of a can of dog food with a finger, because that was all he could find to eat. And that he is not nostalgic about that past, you know. So they really, you know, there is a big divide between La Cuba de ayer as a memory, as a place of desire, and La Cuba de hoy as a memory, as a place of desire.
Okay, and interestingly enough, La Cuba de ayer plays a huge role in the way in which the current government in Cuba structures its tourism.
Oh,
because
absolutely.
it is right. So it's
Oh,
the
absolutely.
appeal, it's the construction of this Disneyfied Cuba de ayer that is meant to draw everyone back in, but only long enough to spend their money and enjoy the hotels and the shows. But that was it.
Go see Hemingway's home, go to Tropicana one night, that sort of thing. Yeah, but you don't get beyond the, you know, what is behind that Cuba, you know.
Well, that's right. That's right. So in a sense, it's kind of interesting to see how the sociology of migration then begins. And of course, now I'm speaking from my own field as a lawyer and as a student of globalization, how that itself then feeds economic policy and social policy within the island. So you've got these just resonances across fields that become very interesting here.
Within the island and also within the exile community. There is a store in Miami called Sentir Cubano, which is interesting in a lot of, it's just knickknacks of that old Cuba, again, you know, La Cuba de ayer. But very expensive sort of knickknacks. I can never go in there and come out having spent less than $200, it seems to me. So that even I am prey to the nostalgia for the past. And it's interesting that they have it's in Calle Ocho, 8th Street, which is symbolic of the Cuban community in Miami, and 32nd Street or so, very close to Versailles. And they have painted the 6 provinces of Cuba, and they refuse to acknowledge that for many years now, Cuba has had many more than 6 provinces. I think it's 15. I can never remember. And then they say that Miami is the 7th province, okay, which I think is accurate.
I would agree.
Even though they don't acknowledge the other provinces, like Mayabeque and Artemisa and so on. So I think it works, you know, these struggles between the past and the present as forms of memory and so on are ongoing both within the island and also, you know, in the exile community.
Okay, and this is actually a great segue for my next set of questions, because it's that memory and that resonance that affects not only in the case that I brought up, which is the construction of the tourist sector in modern Cuba, but it also resonates throughout the Caribbean, which then takes us this idea and ideal from all sides, then migrates, in this case, if I can use a double meaning here, from Cuba, in this case, to Venezuela. And so what I was hoping to discuss a little bit with you, even though I could spend another 4 hours talking to you about migration, but I think this is, our listeners might be interested in this as well, the migration of these ideas, both quote unquote good or bad, depending on your political persuasion, the way it moves to Venezuela and some of the resonances, consequences, connections, and non-connections. And I was hoping maybe you can talk to us a little bit about that, your fascinating work in that area.
Right. Well, it's good. Like, going back to the original question, how did you come to work on a book that compared Cuba and Venezuela? It turns out to be that it was the immigrants that took me there, okay? Having already published a book that incorporated most of the major waves of the Cuban exodus and so on, I thought I would focus on Cuban doctors because la buena medicina, the good medicine, was always an ideal in Cuban society. It's not new with the revolution. You know, my grandfather, my uncles, my cousins, they were all doctors. And there was this, status that people accorded to being a good doctor, which was very important in that culture and that society. And then, of course, during the years of the revolution expands the doctors throughout, literally, the island, up and down mountains and places where La Buena Medicina had not reached prior to that time, and it becomes, expansive. And then you have the movement of doctors Cuban doctors working overseas in misiones, in missions in different countries, And so I thought I would study those, the people who had gone away on the missions to different countries, and then at some point decided to not return to Cuba and leave altogether, not necessarily assuming, waiting to see what my interviews would tell me, not necessarily assuming that there were strictly economic reasons for which people left. Although, of course, in the Cuban case, the economic situation has been so critical and has been a crisis for such a long time that it's impossible for it not to be a part of people's decisions, But at any rate, I began studying the doctors, and I very soon learned that the people who had gone to work in Venezuela had one set of experiences, and the people who had gone to work in other countries like Nicaragua or South Africa or the Seychelles Islands, Haiti, a number of other interviews that I did, were far more straightforward, while the people who had worked in Venezuela had left partly because they understood that they had become part of a political process that they did not want to be a part of. And so I went with my data. I went with where the immigrants took me, once again. You're supposed to go with your data, according to social scientists. And so then I began focusing more and more on the interviews in Venezuela, where very often, for example, I had a very good interview with a young woman who had previously worked in Nicaragua on a mission trip, and then worked a couple of years later in Venezuela. And she also felt used by a political process. She was an ophthalmologist, and she was very good at doing eye operations of the cornea, surgery. And in Venezuela, as throughout the Caribbean, people often acquire what ophthalmologists call terrigio, because they cook with live charcoal and smoke and so on and so forth, and that gets into your eyes, and it becomes kind of like a what do you call it when you have my mom had one,
like a cataract,
like a cataract, right?
Okay.
Where you have to remove it, in order for people to be able to see. And that's what she became good at, removing that cataract with a small surgery. And she said that invariably people would, of course, look up and say, "Thanks be to God, I can see." And then she was supposed to say, "And to Chavez," And after she had done this a lot of times, she realized that she really didn't want to be part of it. And so she started trying to find ways to leave the mission in Caracas that she had become a part of, as she managed to do. So really it was my study of immigrants that took me to look at the Venezuelan case, because I realized that something different was happening there. And all those interviews that I did with the Cuban doctors are now a chapter in this book. My collaborator in the book, Carlos Antonio Romero, is Venezuelan, professor of political science at the Universidad Central de Venezuela. And we met and listened to each other for some years at ASCE meetings. And finally, one time, I was listening to him make comments once again, and I turned around and I said to him, "I think we should do a book together." I came out of nowhere. And that took us years because initially we were only going to cover Chavez and the early period of the Cuban Revolution, the first 15 years or so. But then, of course, Chavez died and Maduro came on, and it was a very different thing, and we had to hang on and keep going. And so, we're now at a point, I think, where hopefully anything that happens in Venezuela, we can still sort of capture at the end of the book. As we are now finishing that book. But it really the book will be a result of ASCE, as is also the article that I recently wrote for Foro Cubano. So ASCE has been very influential in giving some shape to my work, even though I work as a sociologist in more qualitative and historical ways than many people. And I'm not an economist. But still, I think that, ASCE has been an important influence also on my work.
So I can't resist, and
Oh, no.
don't get mad, but I have to ask. So do you view Venezuela as a failed version of a Cuban revolution, or do you view it as inherently its own creature, going in the logic of its own context?
Gosh, it's curious, but I can't put myself squarely in either one of those camps, I don't think. Okay. Because one of the things that Carlos and I, of course, we emphasize the similarities between the two revolutions. They both had extraordinarily charismatic people at the helm, Fidel Castro in particular, Hugo Chavez. They both came out of a socialist ideology and a sort of anti-US nationalism thrust. They both also expressed class inequalities, poverty within those societies of people who had been left behind, left outside, left at the margins, and couldn't see themselves in that future. There are many, many similarities, and they saw themselves as either both succeeding or both failing. Okay, I have a wonderful photo for my book that I have presented at the last ASCE meeting, in which you can see Chavez and Fidel Castro, where they both tied themselves to each other, literally, meaning, we either succeed together or we fail together. Okay. But in fact, they're very different in other rather important ways, and a major difference is that, for example, both religion, the anti-Catholic Church thrust of the Cuban revolution is not there in the Venezuelan revolution. That race plays a role also in the Cuban revolution, so that the revolution essentially portrays itself as being on the side of Black Cubans and expressing Black Cubans. Certainly they opened up, like, for example, the beaches and the country clubs and so on that had been closed to Black Cubans. But then in the end, they also fought wars in Africa, to which they sent a lot of Black Cubans to fight. But race plays a role always within the Cuban Revolution that it doesn't really play within the Venezuelan revolution at all. So and neither does religion. The Catholic Church in Venezuela doesn't have the unifying force that it did for many years within the Cuban Revolution, and doesn't become a site of the opposition either, as it did in the Cuban case. So ultimately, I do see them as a lot of what we strove to do was to understand the many similarities and also the important differences between them.
Okay.
And I can't say I fall into either one of those camps that you presented to me.
Right. And of course, having heard this, you wonder, well, if that's the case, then you have a bunch of outliers that present even more interesting pictures of variation and similarity. Nicaragua, for example, and Bolivia. Now we can actually close the door on, well, although one never does this, on the Bolivian effort to create a revolutionary experience. And there you've got the indigenous element that is lacking the centrality that it has. And in Nicaragua, it should have been closer to the Venezuelan experience, and yet it also went its own way.
Right.
but stuck with a different crew of personality. So there's lots to chew on. And so as I hear you talking about this, I go, oh my God, I want to know more. And there's all this.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, you've been incredibly patient in letting me pick your brain for a long period of time. But I was wondering, so I'm going to ask you to put on your magician's hat.
Oh,
I'm going
no,
to ask you,
yes.
and I'm going to ask you to prognosticate. Do you see, so, and I'll ask it in a very specific way, as opposed to where do you think Cuba will be in 20 years? No one knows.
No, nobody.
You know,
But,
waves of migration. Do you see further potential for additional waves of migration, and will they be either a continuation of los que caminan, los caminantes, or do you see perhaps the start of yet another and quite distinct wave of migration out of Cuba?
well, I think that maybe the way to think about that, I think, is one of the arguments that I make in everything that I write, and certainly in the recent book on Cuba and Venezuela, is that the exodus functioned in two different ways at the same time within the Cuban Revolution. You know, in a positive sort of way, the exodus strengthened the Cuban Revolution because it made all the dissent, the opposition, it externalized it. You know, and there are lots of speeches of Fidel Castro and Raúl and so on where you can see evidence that that is exactly what they thought. Okay, for example, at the time when the people are leaving through the Mariel exodus, Fidel Castro gives a very powerful speech in which he says, before they, meaning the United States, took our doctors, our teachers, our professionals, let them take our lumpen. You know, because it is known that he opened up the prisons and he said, put people on the boats and let them go, you know, so take our lumpen proletariat now, you know. And then he always said, now we're left with the stronger parts. The flab is gone and we have become stronger, okay? And that is true. I really do think that both the embargo and the Cuban exodus, in effect, consolidated the Cuban Revolution, which is the opposite of what I think most people would say.
Right.
At the same time, though, I think that the Cuban exodus always, and even now, has also functioned to rob Cuba of the very best, very most talented people, audacious, adventurous, capable people who could have donated those talents, those resources, that knowledge, that know-how to the revolution. And the revolution has always failed to incorporate them. You know, so I think it has always functioned in both of those ways. What is a little bit different recently, I almost hesitate to use the word now, is that, for example, the door to leaving was fairly open recently, beginning with Bill Clinton's 1994, 1995 migration agreements. As a result of the Balsero crisis, we had the wet foot, dry foot, you know, policy, so that if people found a little boat or anything floating at sea, if the Coast Guard found them, they were considered wet foot and they were returned to Cuba. And that afterwards also was true for Dominicans and Haitians and other people, but it began with the Cuban exodus. While if somehow they managed to skirt past the Cuban, or the Cuban and the American Coast Guards, there's two Coast Guards at stake, at 3 o'clock in the morning when they were sleeping or something, and they arrived on dry land and they didn't drown in the process, as they often did. Then they were dry foot and they could remain, and then the Cuban law of adjustment would kick in and they could become legal residents of the United States within a year or so. Okay, Obama did away with that as part of the reestablishment of relations that people in Cuba saw as very, very, very positive. I mean, they were so happy to have relations reestablished. Not that it had so many economic benefits, although it did for a couple of years. The tourism was enormous. I mean, it's 4 million people a year, tourists to a country of 11 million people, as one of the Cuban government officials described it as an avalanche. And I think that that was true. It was an avalanche, for a couple of years. So it did have economic benefits, but I think that more than anything else, that people were happy not to have to continue all the time fighting into, you know, being made of a part of a conflict that they hardly understood, you know, and that, you know, maybe Fidel Castro had a problem with the United States, but they didn't know why the rest of them had to have
Right,
an enormous problem with the United States, as a taxi cab driver in Cuba told me one time. So Obama closes at the same time that he opens up the relationship between the country politically, and that has economic benefits for the people there. But he closes wet foot, dry foot policy right before he left. And so people in Cuba were actually trying to leave, knowing that that was likely to happen. They were trying to leave before that actually happened. Some of them managed it, some of them didn't. But there is a, you know, and Obama himself said, when people are dissatisfied with their country, they shouldn't leave. They should stay and do something about it from the inside. You know, but nobody paid attention to that part of it.
oh.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to do anything about it within Cuba. They're, you know, they have everything tied up very well, as another one of my interviews told me one time. But at any rate, you know, then there is suddenly almost no way to leave, except when Spain then says that they will consider the grandchildren of the Spanish immigrants as potential Spanish citizens, you know, if they have good behavior and so on. And so a lot of Cubans then begin to go to Spain, including cousins of mine who are there now. There's a few other, you know, sort of third country avenues of exit, but they have all been closed. Okay, so in effect, the Cuban descent at this point in time can virtually not leave. Ecuador, for example, now requires a visa. You know,
Okay,
didn't before, but after Los Caminantes, now they do. You know, there's almost no place where Cubans can go unless they're artists and they happen to play somewhere in the world and they can remain behind. But that's only a few people that can do something like that. So people are far more stuck inside of Cuba than they have been in the recent past. At the same time, in some of the other studies that I have done about political generations, you know, I see the young generation of Cuba who have unfortunately given up on the island. Okay, they really see no future. You know, they don't want to remain. If they can figure out any way to leave, they will, because as they put it to you, there's just nothing that we can do here, and there's no future here. And that's very sad for me. You know, even though I study immigrants and I like immigrants, it's very sad for me to see such an absence of feeling of patria, you know, among people. But they don't know how to fight for it either, or even what it is that they want to fight for. You know, it's 60 years of only a television that is organized by the government, of a press that almost has no independence. There is, as we know, some independent journalists, but they mostly write for the outside at great cost to themselves in the island. So it's almost like they don't know how you carve and create a different future, you know, and they've given up on it. And that's very, very sad, I think. You know, in the case of Venezuela, I would say that there has been recently it's a very different thing. It's not generational in the way in which it is in Cuba, in which you see that the old generations are still sort of affirmed to the role that they played within the revolution. They're disenchanted. There's a lot in Cuba. The phrase is comunistas desencantados, you know, old communists who became disenchanted. Okay. There's a lot of them in my family. I don't even, they're disenchanted, and I've heard people say, I no longer know what to believe in, and I don't think I believe in anything anymore. Well, I tell them, you know, but the difference is that I do. I believe in democracy, you know. So I can understand your dissatisfaction with the society, your criticisms, but I can't understand the fact that you're not pushing for something different, and that difference would be what I call electoral democracy.
Right now, interestingly enough, of course, I sense in my own work that same sort of dissatisfaction among increasing sectors of the American population as well, who are asking exactly the same question. I don't know what to believe in. And those of us, of course, who've had to go from one system to another are probably much less likely to lose our faith in the thing that has been so good and generous to us as people who are born into it, and then all of a sudden look around and there are all kinds of reasons for losing faith. So it's kind of interesting to
Yeah.
see both the way one can kind of get glimmers of similar sorts of discursive movements at the same time that they're very different.
Yeah.
Right.
I call it in my work, I call it political disaffection, you know, a process of
Yeah.
loss of affection for something that people originally believed in or were told was good. Because, you know, Cubans who are my age or a little younger grew up with their parents having committed themselves to that society, but they inherited the problems and
Right.
only the problems, you know, and they've had to deal with the problems. So I call it, you know, disaffection, disenchantment, but at the same time, it doesn't have a, you know, this is what we should be working for.
Right.
There is, of course, a dissident movement in Cuba and has been for many years, and I would take my hat off to them if I had a hat, because they have such a courage, and they do know what they're fighting for. And they know they're fighting for the principles embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in Charter 77, you know, in the important worldwide movements that established democracy as not only a political, but also a social movement.
Yeah.
And they do know it, but the vast majority of the people don't know it, you know, and
Right.
they're just unhappy and dissatisfied. And of course, the Cuban government has been very good at not allowing anyone to express, you know, that in a popular sort of way. You know,
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
probably Osvaldo Payá comes the closest to that, and we know what happened to Payá.
Yeah. All right. And on that note, I'm afraid that we must draw ourselves to a close here. This has been just so incredibly fascinating, and I am so grateful for you to have taken the time. And I want to offer you the last word. Any closing thoughts before we say goodbye to our audience?
No, my only closing thoughts are to make people aware of ASCE. It has a great name, Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. And I usually add and society, not capitalized,
Right.
because today ASCE has economists, but also lawyers, sociologists, engineers, lots of other people. In effect, it has become more and more public policy.
Yes.
And I think that this is important. And we will be having, thanks to you, our first, I don't want to say annual because, because it's our first, but maybe it will continue, virtual conference that we're working very hard on. And I want people to be aware of that, however, that ASCE is quite old. ASCE is perhaps the oldest Cuban American institution directed to the study of Cuba, and that it's now going to be 30 years old. And we want everybody to participate in the virtual conference. Hopefully the virus will allow us to have the January conference, January 4th through 6th at FIU, Florida International University in Miami, which is something else we very much want.
And thank you for that plug. I almost forgot.
Yeah. And so we are struggling with a difficult situation, as is everyone in this country and in large part of the world, but we're doing our best to continue going down the roads that were opened up by ASCE's economists many years ago, 30 years ago.
All right. Well, on that note, thank you very, very much. This has been just a delight. And for our audience, stay tuned. Please have a listen and stay tuned for our next set of interviews. And until next time, we will all see each other later.
Thank you, Larry. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Sure.
You're a great interviewer. Thank you.
All right.
Bye.